did they say? He said, well, everything's normal. They just said you're stressed. So I said, so your stress test was negative, but they're telling you you're stressed. Okay.
Something wrong with this picture.
Well, there is. So those tests being negative, meaning his heart was healthy, doesn't imply that he's flourishing and well-being. And I said, well, when did this start? What was going on when this started? And he said, well, it was the same time my thyroid shut down. And I said, well, what happened to your thyroid? He said, well, I just stopped working. And I said, well, what was going on in that? What was happening in your life? It's because you talk to the other people and they're telling you nothing's wrong. So just play with me. What was happening in your life? He said, well, I was in love with a woman that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, and she dumped me. Now, from an archetypical perspective, the throat chakra has a lot to do with grief.
It's just all this stuff. Do you? I know a little bit about the chakra. Yeah. So it really does. All this really is
100%.
Okay.
Well, finish that question.
Like when you were talking about this, the certain part of the body, I was thinking in my mind. Does that go? Does it go with the chakras? To the chakras?
It sure does. And here's the cool thing about the chakras. Who here has heard of the chakras? There are these 7 energy centers that came out of the Indian tradition, Indian mystical tradition. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, who basically started yoga, laid all this out. And basically, they called them energy centers, sort of subtle energy centers. But what we know now is actually these are major nerve plexuses. Have you ever snorkeled or anything and see sea anemones with their little fingers? That basically the chakras are major nerve centers where there's just these plexuses. Plexus means like a group of nerves. And these also have high density of these emotional neuropeptide receptors. Very, very interesting.
It's very scientific. Really.
Absolutely.
I mean, they usually go from a different standpoint when it's about chakras, but it really, no matter what standpoint you kind of come back to the same thing.
That's right. That's
because
right.
It really is all related.
That's right. And there actually is a scientific basis for that. 3,000 years ago, they didn't have any concept of, nerves and peptides. So what we know now through anatomical study, that all those chakras correspond to heavy, dense areas. And furthermore, that those nerve areas have way more receptor sites for these emotional neuropeptides than anywhere else in the body. So it makes sense that these chakras become centers of emotion and different levels of emotion. Isn't this interesting? So, again, function, emotion, get a greater range of emotion, have more energy in motion, therefore affect function. This is a great gift.
So how did where he lost his girlfriend affect his throat?
Sure. So from my perspective, I think there were a number of different aspects to that. One is he wasn't able to fully be with that grief. It was overwhelming. And for a man, the sense of grieving and loss and really heartfelt mourning is often not okay in our society. Just an observation. Not everybody grows up with that, but I know I sure did. That you basically just pull your pants back on and you put your shoes on and you just go for it. And you accomplish and you achieve and you do. That's generally
just get over it.
Get over it, move on. Big boys don't cry. Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. So this is a major center for grief and gratitude. So a really healthy throat chakra, someone with great gratitude, they have a very clear voice, they can speak their truth. In a rather inhibited throat chakra, I find that they tend to not be able to have grief, they don't tend to have a clear voice, and often can hold back from really expressing what's true for them. So I think that this affected energetically his thyroid, which I also can tie neurologically to the very cervical vertebrae where the nerves that come out and go to the thyroid were, because remember I said that a loss of emotion implies a loss of range of emotion, which then places a torque and a stretch on the nerves, which just a dime's pressure on a nerve can decrease its functionality by 60%. So therefore now he has this functional imbalance, right, because emotion has now affected this. And with the chest stuff, what I saw is that T1 and 2 have direct nerve flow to the heart. And there's also the heart chakra center. I believe his energetic heart was broken. Which is a beautiful thing for all of us to experience, that the heart is made to be broken so it can get bigger and bigger and bigger and more compassionate so it can hold the world. This is, at least in the Roman Catholic tradition, the Sacred Heart of Jesus is a beautiful metaphor for this. So that's what I think was going on, and C5 and 6 also has to do with a sense of betrayal and loss, but not being okay with that, so it has nowhere to go. So now this energy and motion is basically just fixated, and it will show up as symptoms which he experienced. Now, if you have chest pain, please go to your cardiologist first. He did the right thing, and as is the case most of the time, hopefully it shows up to be, don't know what to tell you. You're stressed. Thanks, doc. What do I do now? Don't know. So just want to put that out. I think it's a really good example. So the third gift of the spine is a sense of self. The third gift of the human nervous system is a sense of self. It's so funny. I had another woman who came in today who teaches the Enneagram. Really cool stuff. I know it's so cool. I know enough about it to be dangerous, so I'm not going to say a word about it. But what we were talking about is after our consultation, she was just telling me about her excitement about the Enneagram and these different archetypes. And she was saying, she was having fun asking me questions, trying to understand my Enneagram type. And I said, well, I can relate to what you're saying here, here, and here. And she said, the healthiest people will have a harder time narrowing themselves down because they have a very flexible sense of self. It's harder to get nailed down into one thing. Likewise, so think, if I have all these emotions now of this, frustration or grief that I didn't provide, papers for you guys, and all of a sudden that feeds into a sense of self that I'm not good enough and that I don't follow through and I don't pay attention to details. And rather than just a fleeting emotion that now shows me to take a different action, now this becomes an article of my sense of self. Not so good. If my body is locked in a certain position, and my sense of self tends to match that. So the healthier we are, the greater range of a sense of self that we have. Because ultimately, we're not super identified with a sense of self. We're identified to ourselves as loving souls, as a spiritual being having a temporary human experience. But a very fixated sense of self, well, I'm a lawyer, I'm a banker, I'm a doctor, or I'm a preacher. I'm the shepherd to my flock. I'm a spiritual counselor. I'm this, I'm that. Whenever we get, and this is just my opinion, but whenever that sense of self gets very rigid, this is actually, quite challenging. And I find that the more rigid a sense of self someone has, the more rigid their body architecture will be. Because their sense of self is matching this very stern and hard sense of self within, and their body will match the same thing. Now, the harder our body is, the less range of emotion we have, and the less function we have. The more fluid our sense of self is, the more fluid our body is going to be, the more fluid our posture is going to be, the more fluid our emotion is going to be. And ultimately, the healthier at a baseline the body's function is going to be. I mean, assuming you're not just sitting by yourself drinking, coffee all day and smoking cigarettes and watching Fox News. Fox News is okay if you like that, by the way. I tend to think any media outlet that's putting vitriol and intentional heartbreak out there needs to identify their own sense of self. So, sense of self, we also know, too, tends to be neurologically very linked into the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. So the more we're in lizard brain, the more we're stressed and overburdened by stress, the more we tend to have this activation of the amygdala. So just think lizard brain and grizzly bear brain. Now these things remember. They remember the past, and they don't want you to do anything that's going to make you feel like you did in the past. So it's going to set up a sense of self that won't have to feel those painful emotions. For most of us, when painful emotions arise, we tend to develop psychologically a sense of self around that will keep us from feeling that same pain again. So in the shadow aspect of a sense of self, it becomes a defensive mechanism whereby we prop up different personas to hide what we feel is real inside. So just think, remember, character is the mark of the soul. Persona was the Latin word for the masks that theater actors wear. So a sense of self is often constructed, literally becomes constructs, personas that we wear so that people don't see the broken heart. Like, God, I lost the girl I loved and I feel like it was my own fault and I've never let go of this, and now I have a sense of self that I'm not lovable, that I won't mean anybody, and this, I promise you, has showed up for this gentleman many, many times, because now he's 53 and he's like, I've never really been able to connect with anybody since. I mean, that got my heart chakra going. Oh my God. So does this make sense? Sense of self is directly tied to emotions. Now, developmentally speaking,